all. Happy President's Day. We have a legend with us today for the Colloquium series. That should be on your bulleted list here. So a man who needs no introduction, but we'll give him a quick one anyway, because he certainly earned it. So Professor Eduardo Brondizio is an elected member of the National Academies of Sciences. He's a distinguished professor of anthropology. He's the director of CASTLE. He is a god among insects, as far as I'm concerned. So he's going to be presenting a really, really interesting paper today that I quite enjoyed. Making place-based sustainability initiatives visible in the Brazilian Amazon with a whole team of others. So certainly, and I know you would underscore that repeatedly. It's not just your own work here, but we're thrilled to have you, Edu, especially on this 50th anniversary of the Colloquium series. And thanks for all your service to the workshop as a senior research fellow for so many years. So please join me in welcoming Edu. Okay.
What a responsibility now you put on my back.
That's a high bar. You can do it.
Thank you so much. Such an honor to be back to the colloquium. Really an honor, especially this year, and to see everybody here and online. Thank you for joining us. First, a note of excuse because I couldn't share the paper that supports this. It seemed right in the middle of a major revision, and we decided it wouldn't be appropriate. So I used some of that material here. Acknowledge all my co-authors, I hope, through the presentation. And I provided a paper that I hope gave a sort of a context which to understand the kinds of issues that we're talking about. I'm going to briefly explain what I'm going to do. I'll try to stay within the half an hour at most, because it's more like a presentation. So I'll have to skip some things quickly, and maybe we can pick it up during discussion. I'll just introduce for 3 to 5 minutes the context, right, before I enter into the actual project, which is the Agents Project, in which myself and my collaborators, I think here present is Sasha, and I think I saw Krister there, and a series of collaborators and workshoppers have been working for the past 4 years, okay? So I don't think it's any surprise, but this I think is one illustration of how much the Amazon has been transforming over the past 5 decades. I think it's perhaps the world's most accelerated case of transformation. And today the region is basically a mosaic of conflicts and ideas about environment, right? And agendas that are local to global intersecting and deciding, what's the future of the region, what are the abilities to address these issues. Knowledge about the consequence, and I'm here just to be an example of environmental consequence. As we learn the expansion of deforestation in the region, just like this last month, we had one report that pushed back projections for a tipping point to a drier ecosystem under business as usual scenario to about 25 years, right? So the time and the pace of change in the region has become very accelerated, and also this sort of positive feedback system that are compounding and enhancing the scale of those impacts as we speak. Right, so this is the context upon which we're taking one angle to look at the transformation in the region, the actors behind the transformation of the region. Now, usually, and I'll give a little bit of context of the work we've been doing, usually, and for most of the history of the Amazon, explanations about the drivers of change and the directions of change have focused on larger, very structural factors. And for most of the history of the Amazon, that would explain almost everything because of the power of central state and central decision-making, and blueprints, development programs really shaped the Amazon and the structure of change, for many decades. My argument has been for a while that, during the 1990s, we have a system change in the region as a whole, when connectivity and other factors have intersected in a way in which those sorts of explanations are not enough to capture the direction of change. So for many decades, in fact, we've been approaching this from the perspective from the bottom up, right? And trying to understand the role of local decision-making, whether households or communities, in how their decisions create patterns and emergent landscape as a response to those external factors. So we've been approaching as a process in which we're sort of bringing together here, just in a very quick and dirty way, a long history of environmental anthropologist's approach to understand adaptive strategies on the ground with a political ecology approach, right? That gives us a context in which this is a process of disputing territories, powers, and resources. And over time, I think the approach that we bring here, that we call a grounded complex systems perspective to socio-ecological systems, is one that combines elements of Anthony Giddens' structuration theory and linguistic collective action theory, which to me are very much similar approaches to similar problems. And I've been trying to treat, those situations in which actors that are conditioned or have opportunities with external forces and processes, their decision end up shaping those processes in themselves, right? And creating emergent outcomes that sort of shape the region as a whole. I've been applying this for many kinds of problems, in particular, two problems that are, that have for many years used this approach to explain. One is the regional expansion of agroforestry systems, which happen as, a process of independent decision makers of smallholder farmers responding to market opportunities that over time has created landscapes that have transformed the region in many ways, and many parts of the region today are, an outcome of those individualized decisions, right, that are non-intentional in nature, but that create landscapes that emerge on the aggregate. So we've been using that to understand the evolution and the expansion of agroforestry systems, why households start to move and migrate to urban areas out of opportunities and conditions that have facilitated decision-making to expand from their rural scene, landscapes, and how rural urban networks are behind the process of regional urbanization, away from just an external process in which, urban planning have been put up in the region. I try to explain this process as actually a combination of those external interventions with bottom-up decisions about migration and multi-sited households in a series of processes that then end up relating to those regional conditions and shaping them themselves into new systems. And so that's a context in which to present sort of my view upon which we're going to dig in one particular phenomena that has been happening in the region, which is a very contrary to those phenomena, a very intentional phenomenon, right? How people are mobilizing themselves, their assets, their ideas, and their partnerships to change their reality on the ground, right? We're calling place-based initiatives. So this is, in particular, today I'm talking about the Agents Project, where this large group of people, several people who are workshoppers, long-term workshoppers, that we worked between 2019 and until last year. It is a project focused on documenting and understanding and making visible these kinds of initiatives that people are taking on the ground to confront the problems that are taking place. Here are the funders. I'll go back to thank them. This is also part of the Sustainable Food System Science Project here at IU, right, which many of us here are part of. And they have supported, that project has supported an important part of this work, particularly the agroforestry part. So this project emerged out of actually a demand initially of the Convention of Biological Diversity. They asked Christer Anderson, who is online, and myself and Carl Salk and others to ask that question. What is the role of non-state actors in conservation? How can we measure and quantify this at a larger scale, right? Because that has been an invisible part of, the effort, for instance, in that case, of the CBD, the Convention of Biological Diversity. So that was the initial motivating question for this project, the role of non-state actors, individual and collective action in biodiversity, watershed management and conservation in general. how can we develop methodologies to estimate that, right? And so it can be used more broadly. So that was the starting of the project.
And hold on 1 minute, we'll mute that.
It's in Portuguese.
Relevant there, right? Okay.
So one thing about, and I'll talk about the process of the project. Yeah, sorry about that. I'll talk about the process of the project in a second. So we focus on 3 areas where we have long-term research and long-term collaborations, right, in different regions of the Amazon, where we see this sort of processes intersecting, right? That's what we want to do, to see the actions that are coming up in regions that are fastly transformed over time. What are place-based initiatives? We define in that paper, and there's very similar concepts that are used across a range of other types of research, but we basically define as those that are on the ground, led by people who, you know, take the risks and are the people benefiting on the ground. It may involve collaboration, or actually may have started outside, right? But people took it up and to continue and to implement them. So we have a definition that has been very useful for us to identify a diversity of initiative that takes place in the region. They have, in almost all cases, they're not local, they're not isolated, quite the opposite. In fact, now I'll mention that in a second. They are connected very broadly on a wide range of, you know, sort of collaborations. And their aim is very diverse as well. Usually, you sort of can think about, you know, a group of efforts that relates to changing production system and resources, right? Improving more sustainable sort of productions and resource management, restoration, improving, you know, life standards at the local level. A series of political goals as well. In many of these areas, these are regions of a long history of marginalization and external control and violence, creating opportunities for the youth. One other very important group has to do with creating micro-industries, value aggregation, you know, verticalizing market chain, so they take control of those and the benefits of what they produce and their knowledge. So that's basically what we're asking, you know, what pathways in a context of conflict, what pathways can such place-based initiatives pursue to address the problems that they're dealing with, right? So we got asking about what are the challenges for establishing and maintaining them, in what ways external programs and policies and programs can be leveraged or, you know, sometimes overwhelmed. And then in what ways their knowledge on a variety of ways and capacity are important in taking up those initiatives and trying to understand common factors among them. I think, you know, in many ways, the question is kind of the reverse question of governing the commons, right? Just in the sense that, you know, how can communities can maintain external pressures to maintain their long-term viability and sustainability. We're sort of asking in what ways can those collective actions deal with external pressures and eventually leverage on them, try to sustain and to achieve their goals. So it's really picking on the key problem of interventions between internal and external processes that Lynn explained so well, right, in covering the commons. So this is part, I mean, there's a very booming literature on these kinds of topics around actually for a while. This is just an example of what has been, you know, some of the issues that have been appear in so-called transformation to sustainability literature. But you find very similar approaches, very similar kinds of concepts in, you know, we have a list of things that we do in that paper that we review, like watershed management, cities and neighborhoods, where you have similar initiatives to the ones we were talking about, indigenous justice movements, cooperatives, and a whole literature on cooperatives, community-based resource management. This is very, very similar things, and a number of other kind of efforts that look into grassroots movements, associations, and collective actions locally, right? So this is a really interesting literature, very, very interdisciplinary, talk about those issues that facilitate or hinder, right, local initiatives to deal with the problems that they deal with, the potential of enabling factors, hindering factors, as I said. And one of the big questions is, in what ways cross-scale interactions facilitate or hinder, these efforts at a local level. So I want to talk briefly about the process of doing this research, because this is a very unique type of project. The program that funded this was a international program called the Belmont Forum and the North Face program, which brings together funding agencies from different countries. So you apply as a team of international researchers. And the program was very much focused on this question of transformations to sustainability. And in a way that would be participatory as a research approach. So we took a research approach that was participatory from the very beginning, meaning that from that larger question, we started to define the actual research goals and process and collaborators once we're doing this, what we call dialogue workshops in the region. So we did a series of dialogue workshops, produced reports, right? Produced more kind of fine-tune the questions and the issues that we want to really center attention on. All of those processes in an interactive way. So every material that we produced was sort of part of a sequence in which we would return to the collaborators on the ground, get their feedback, and continuing that process all the way to the end. So a series of workshops and field research. We visit at least 50 types of initiatives, and then we are hit by the pandemic. It completely changed the direction of this research, but in some ways in a positive way. So lots of on the ground research. And then, as part of the pandemic as well, we put an enormous emphasis on developing a database that would be regional, right? And one of the postdocs, Marina Londres, and a team of undergraduates, including from IU, start filling in a database that supports the project. We also develop a geospatial platform, right, that would allow us to do analysis between our fieldwork database, geospatial analysis to look at landscape level change. Several reports produced at each stage and returned. Then we move it to the virtual dialogue workshop space. We did a series of virtual dialogues to continue that process that we started. Christer Anderson and team did a fantastic series of about 12 virtual workshops with the research site in Peru. It was a very successful effort during the pandemic to maintain and to get their perspective on issues. And towards the end, one thing that we put a lot of emphasis on, which was last year, was a series of restitution events. So besides translating papers and so forth, we organized a workshop of 2 days, actually 2.5 days, with participants that we worked with to discuss the results and get their feedback, sort of have a joint discussion of results. We did a series of training of the use in those communities to produce videos that would showcase their activities. And this is the video series, which I invite you to look at YouTube at the end of. And we did public events in Santarém to show and to kind of share the results of the project. So I want to show that because the research process is really important. And I don't think you can address this kind of issues without doing, at least I don't do it anymore, without doing a participatory way, right? And actually our new project, it starts actually with those we are collaborating on the field at the proposal level. So they're part of the proposal writing together. This is the kinds of things that we're talking about, right? Activities that the range, a span of productive activities, of governance arrangements, of associations with particular purpose, a number of value aggregation and mini industries and new technologies to aggregate value, restoration, a series of community-based management for forest products, for non-timber forest products, for fisheries. So it gives you an idea of the universe of initiatives that is out there. This led to a database, which was one of the outcomes of the project, which includes now about 200 types of initiatives, distributed over about 900 locations and 184 municipalities. The database is a very large database, 114 variables. The really detailed one are the 24. Then we have a number of structured variables to allow us different kinds of analysis. And you see the distribution of some of the kinds of initiatives. Which I'll show examples, but you've got a sense of. So this is the support infrastructure behind it, which is connected to a geospatial platform that allows us to do analysis. So I'll show you some examples. This is just a copy of a copy, but an example where visiting initiatives, starting a documentation of initiatives, understanding their purpose, locating them where they are and what context they are happening, and that enters into our database, which looks like that when you put on a map. This one only has 147 initiatives because some initiatives are actually hard to pinpoint or we have limited information. But yeah, I mean, one thing that it shows is how widespread, they are in the region, and far from localized, they have been and are replicated in a lot of places. So these are examples of maps, non-timber activities, timber-based activities like long-term forest management for wood. Water-based activities are mostly community-based management of fisheries, and I'll show one example. Also community-based management of turtles and shrimp in some case. These are agroforestry and agricultural sites where agroforest transition is taking place, usually in areas previously occupied by Sweden cultivation or pasture. Yeah, so I'm sort of giving you an overview of saying, so what is the context and the historical context in which we understand this initiative? So first is, how do they emerge in parallel to the history of occupation and deforestation? This is a graph of deforestation trends. I show that picks up in the paper, kinds of explains the reasons for that. And you see that also as part of a reaction in different programs, you see the emergencies or the number of initiatives that we documented that started to appear over time, also coincidentally with, of course, the occupation of the region. And that, behind that, there's several ideas, stories, ideologies, and policies that are important to understand how it's happening today and why it's happening today. So in terms of context, we kind of give three very broad kind of, large paradigms and narratives of development in the region. They each have a particular role or particular kinds of impacts. But most important in many cases, are this we call enablers, programs that have really shaped the organization, the political organization at the ground level and have allowed to finance or to be recognized. Liberation theology and basic education movement are at the root of most of these initiatives. So when you talk to the generation that is at the head of, sort of the first generation, they're going to point to the importance of that early stages of, giving us voice, putting us together as a community, organize ourselves as a group, sort of a whole series of processes that led to the initial formation of local associations. PPG7 may not be familiar to you, is the program for combating deforestation. Huge program started with Rio 92, between Germany in particular and Brazil, one of the largest program ever done, perhaps one of the most impactful to date program in the Amazon. Behind this program, you have some of the biggest programs for deforestation combat. We have the establishment of indigenous lands and protected areas throughout the Amazon with funding from PPG7 and hundreds of local pilot projects of sustainability, many of which have failed, but many of which are now at the roots of the initiatives that we see today. And that's a process. And see, they start to emerge. It's a really interesting process in which, of course, most of those external interventions that come with resources create expectations, create enthusiasm in a region where you have a vacuum of everything. Many of them go through, what I call the syndrome of pilot projects, right? External input, give all the money, the ideas from the outside, and you get it going, and it's gonna, as soon as the subsidy goes, the project goes away, right? We have a history of such projects in the region, but also a history of learning from failures, right? And actually learning today, which is very present in these initiatives, that they need to be in the leadership. They learn that, sort of money, that funding that comes from the outside is always welcome, right? But funding that comes without us giving the direction of that funding, we know that's not gonna, bear very good fruit. So really interesting process of learning that have now paved the way for the way they work. And a continuous process of new alliance and leaderships that have been emerging, including now between initiatives that are formerly isolated and are forming confederations and larger arrangements to deal with larger problems. Almost getting to my time, but I'm getting to the end as well because I'm rushing. Trying to interpret and summarize some of the ideas. This better be if I started with this and then kind of populated, but the idea that, we are documenting a number of triggers, right? In which interact with a number of contextual issues. Besides the traditional contextual issues of the IAD, right, we're talking about that context, previous failures, experience, leadership, pressures that are happening right now, and what we've seen over one of the evolutions that we have seen over this period is that not all, but most initiatives, instead of focusing on one dimension, which has been the tradition of the sorts of intervention, let's improve your production system. Let's create an association, right? Let's, do this product for this market and so forth. Nowadays, those three things may be different entry points, but they are seen as an integrated process. They know that if I just, I can produce the best fruit here, but I'm not gonna sell it for the price that it deserves, right? And it may be threatened if I don't take care of the territory, from other pressures and so forth. So really interesting processes that we are seeing, that integration of production, governance, broadly speaking, and markets as part of the strategies that they are confronting those issues, right? With a number of outcomes, but also we still see frustration, bankruptcy, failures, and that still happen and depend a lot on the context in which those initiatives are. Those pressures are sometimes overwhelming for their capacity to deal with that, right? And that's a situation in many parts of the region. Some key points in terms of landscape context. Most initiatives that we documented are in landscapes that are forest primary or secondary or managed forests, right? So there's that close association between those initiatives and landscapes that are either recovering or maintaining forest cover. Many of such contributions, and I'll show one in which Sasha and I have been working on, are completely invisible still, right? Both statistically and socially, they just don't come up as important contributions, even though some of those contributions are the most important economic contributions in the region. And you also see that in spite of the dominance of forest cover, they are always in mosaics in which other pressures are neighboring them. This work that Sasha and I have been doing, which is to try to show that impact on the larger landscape. And this is a combination of field research, satellite imagery, and some advanced deep learning algorithms, where we are trying to actually show how those localized agroforestry systems actually are dominant in landscapes, although invisible. I mean, there's no such map like this or such estimation like this besides verbal estimation or guessing from the Statistics Institute. So that's one thing that we see, and we can show that impact is probably. And along those same initiatives, that area is an area where this cooperative works. We also see that combination of very successful cooperatives that have been able to carve their space and sort of mediate between the producers and consumers elsewhere through a value aggregation process. The challenges are there, but you see a lot of interesting things. Another example of scaling up and out is the community-based management of Arapanho, which Adriana, myself, Carly, and others have been working, which is one of the most fascinating systems of community-based management, which started just 20-some years ago, when the fish was basically to a brink of extinction. Right? And through community-based management process, which has a fascinating history in itself, the stocks have largely recovered today. And just in the state of Amazonas, there are about 1,000 communities that participate on community-based management. Also full of problems, right? A story of success, full of challenges and problems that we're trying to understand in this particular project. But the point here, it can scale up and can scale out in ways that are incredible. They can also disappear. And this is one of the work of one of the project postdoc, Diana Turn, who is doing an analysis of community disappearing, appearance in this region of Santarém, where, basically here there are 153 communities mapped here. Of 47 of those communities, 27 have disappeared. 7 are almost disappearing and others are reducing. So it's a very constant and continuous pressure in many contexts. I have taken the table out, but I'm just going to briefly talk about two kind of hypotheses that we've been working through in this paper, right? To compare initiatives and look at this kind of well-known variables of local leadership and being grounded locally vis-a-vis externally externally kind of managed. And related to the diversity of partnership. How does that influence the success of what they define are their goals in different areas? And there's a map that also Sasha has been working on that looks at, in this case, we have 157 initiatives in 671 locations where various conditions intersect or not. Right? And so basically, the ones that are dark sort of have all those conditions, present, right? They are locally led, they have diverse strategies, and they pursue different outcomes. And then you have those who are more specific and those who combine two of those initiatives. And so what we've been finding, is that indeed those variables that we expect to work, right? Local leadership, they are the leadership, they are the helm. The project reflects what they want, right? The agenda is, the internal agenda is important. The ones that have partnerships tend to have, reach more of their intended outcomes, and partnerships here mean between them sometimes, right? For instance, the community-based of fisheries, it's a good example where it started at community level, and then you have a fishing agreement, which are the immediate community in your lake system, right? And from there on, you see sort of the emergence of different forms of collaboration across fishing accords and across large regions that are forming sort of confederations, in fact, to be able to deal with the problems that they cannot deal with isolated. So partnership are key on a number of fronts. It has been even more key during the past 4 years because they're all under threat, all under pressure. So partnerships to deal with violence, monitoring, conflicts, have been really important. What else? Connect with actors, work collectively to overcome local bottlenecks, and continuously learning from each other, new ways of doing things. So you see a lot of diffusion of the region. So some final points. As I said, local protagonism plus external partnership, kind of a very important sort of intersection to support local initiatives. Evidence for scaling out and amplifying impacts. We see that. We also see evidence for disappearing and being overwhelmed in particular contexts. Invisibility is still sort of the dominant, which is a very important issue because if you cannot quantify the contribution that they have for employment, for production, for ecosystem services, for food production, it's very hard to kind of make an argument against the biggest force and development investments that are taking place in the region. It is also, you have all these agendas that are looking at the Amazon in a very intense way, should I say like that, right? And the extent to which the opportunities that are coming with new climate financing, new biodiversity financing, the new bioeconomy paradigm, the extent to which is going to involve them, right? It's still a question, right? In what ways they will be able to take the leadership on some of these agendas, right? And benefit from these investments in a way that leverage what they are doing, right? Which demands on considering that what they're doing is impactful, right? And it has a large regional effect. Regional logistical infrastructure is a major issue, way beyond them. One example, again, the fishing, their appointment, they have done everything, done a wonderful management job, prepares fish for markets in Sao Paulo, in other places. The cost of logistics and the difficulty of logistics from, ice to, sort of large scale freezer and transportations. It's huge, right? Even when they are able to develop the most successful system on the ground, logistics depends on, sort of issues above them. A bottom-up polycentricity, which is an interesting, I think, phenomenon that we see emerging as initiatives are progressively aligning with initiatives in their region, in other regions, and in a larger region. So you see this combination of alliances, right, that they are forming to strengthen their position and also to overcome some of these problems. That's it. These are ongoing projects. The agency is ending. We have one just focused on the fisheries, a wonderful project. One focus on value chains in collaboration with the people that we worked with the first project, and one focus on biosphere reserves and the initiatives on biosphere reserves. Visit our video, and thank you so much. It was a lot in 40 minutes, so sorry for that.
It was a tour de force, but it was incredible. And I know that we'll barely be able to scratch the surface over the next 20 minutes, but are you able to hang out for some food afterwards?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have
We can continue. Oh, good. Okay. Fair enough. But at least we'll get started now. So I think we always let students go first, so please. So please, Shannon, and then I saw Mike, but if there's any other students as well or otherwise.
I have two quick comments and a question. The first is, I love participatory research. I can often feel elusive, so thank you for explicitly stating exactly how you did it. The second will come to a shock to my teachers probably, that I think looking at a framework may benefit, which I know you already have a million involved in that. The advocacy coalition framework kind of breaks down those managerial structures and the different groups and how they correspond with each other. I think you're already doing it, but may provide some literature on how to kind of get at it a little bit more explicitly. Then my third point question, do you think this is replicable to other regions, or is there something specific about this region that makes it unique? I'm just thinking as we start to see variant grassrooted social movements that not only deal with sustainability, but deal with societal impacts as well, if you think this could be extended.
Thank you, Shannon. So the framework, thank you for the framework. We are just starting this other project called Linkages, and the project starts from collaboration, as I said, from the proposal stage with cooperatives, with people who are doing so non-traditional. And yeah, I'll take a look. We may benefit quite well of this framework, which we've been doing by learning and it's our own experience. Replicable, I'll say totally, in part because, you know, this is already going on in many regions. So I briefly mentioned examples here, but I could actually give you actually concrete examples and citations of place-based research that are taking place across Africa, Asia, and so forth. There's a whole community around a research network program called PAX, People and Ecosystem Change Network, which is part of Future Earth, which is basically dedicated to documenting, you know, at one point called Seeds of a Good Anthropocene, like seeds, you know, actions like this that represent kind of, you know, seeds on the ground for people dealing with problems. So it is a framework that you find across nowadays many efforts, similar efforts taking place.
Thank you so much.
I hope we can contribute from this perspective to those efforts as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Diego, yeah. We'll turn to Mike.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information. It's really amazing to see Latin American research. In my case, I'm really interested about following the participatory kind of research from two perspectives. First of all, how you were able to manage like different levels of experience in research, more into the sense that the hierarchy of PAs doesn't affect like the generation of ideas, and also because was founded by an international entity, how local are really able to contribute to the research. And also when the research is done, and now that you were talking about the videos and all of that, how the research is being shared with different levels of relation of scholarship, let's say.
Yeah, excellent questions. So I think we, you know, any project, a much more participatory project, you know, starts with the culture of the group. And, you know, the kind of position that we want all research members to be, you know, to bring to the table. And, you know, when you form a group like this, like the 5 PIs that we were, trusted each other, right? We know that we can work on the ground with very simple people, right? Without having any concern, you know, of insecurities or anything. So that starts right there. I mean, you have to have this very special kind of, you know, people to work in partnership with, you know, on the ground, like the kinds of initiatives. And I think we try, whether it's perfect or not, it's another thing, but we try to have that culture of the project, you know, very central from the day one, right? These are the people that we respect the most, those collaborators on the ground. That needs to be very clear to all members of the team. The way we structure our stakeholders, or we call dialogue workshops, right? I think we're also intended to put the emphasis on their experience, their knowledge, and that the questions that we brought in were open, right? To understand what priorities people actually have, you know, in taking forward these initiatives. So we try to structure things in a way that would minimize those, you know, sort of hierarchies, as you say, or kind of position, right? Yeah, otherwise the project wouldn't even, you know, make sense from where we departed to. It was exactly to break those barriers. We produced material at every stage. We turned the material in the language at every stage, very well illustrated, something that people could use, right? And that create that accountability that, you know, yeah, he came here, did this, produced a report, illustrate, gave it back, and, you know, something that people could hopefully use. Yeah, there are limitations of local participation. This particular program, you know, a major limitation, in fact, which is the partner Brazilian funding agents. Here is NSF. The partner Brazilian funding agents was the agents from São Paulo, which is in the south. So we didn't have funds, you know, for university and collaborators in the north. They created big problems, you know, which we overcame in this new project because we basically have those from the beginning, those collaborators. So there are limitations there. The sharing, as I said, at every stage, we try to share the material produced. The last workshop, we brought representatives from different regions, and we didn't present what we found. We thought, here are the results. How do we make sense of them? And we had this discussion about making sense of the results together, from which at the end we generated kind of an open letter that kind of summarized some of the discussion. We did public events, we did all those things. So thank you.
I think Mike was next, and then Krister, it looks like.
I don't get to make sure we have time for Krister on this. This is really impressive stuff. And I hope to have a chance to talk to you about some of this in more detail later on. But a couple of things. I wanted to second your comment about how what you're doing here is a nice complement to what Lynn did in governing the commons. Because a year or so ago, I was trying to put together some videos and sort of looking back on polycentric governance and sort of how that happens, and look at the process of self-organization and sort of looking at the various sorts of interests. And Lynn has a lot of stuff in there about the trust and the social capital and the ways you need to sort of organize with that. But when I started looking at it, it seemed to me that the self-organization process doesn't mean that it's only the locals are doing this, okay? And if you look at this process through which a group of people get together with an idea, define a problem, start to think about what their alternatives are, start to get resources, start to implement some tests, do some implementation, do some evaluation. It got to be a pretty long video. I didn't type my way through all that stuff. But there were things that different actors, external actors, could do to assist at each and every step along the way there. I mean, different people, different organizations, different experts would be coming in at different times. And so the trick for the local community is maintaining control of them. Because you got all these resources you could draw upon, and you're helping them draw upon these resources by connecting to these funding agencies that they're not going to be able to get to directly anyway. So you're part of that external group that's sort of helping them. And that's not been picked up very well, I don't think, in the way the people working with the Ostrom tradition have looked at polycentricity. It's always bottom up, but it's bottom up sort of using what resources are above in doing that. So what you're doing is a really important sort of moving forward onto that. And let me skip to sort of another point, because this is a more pointed sort of comment. You showed the slide from this paper that you had us read, that the circle with the different kinds of projects, cooperatives, associations, programs, farming systems, micro industries, and all these different sort of ways. You know, you went through more detailed examples of by substance, by whether there were fisheries or forests or something like that. But these were different institutional sort of mechanisms that these groups are using. And I think that that's one way that, as an analyst, you and your team could develop some sort of sense of, for what kinds of problems are each of these institutional solutions best suited. So cooperative is not a panacea for everything, but there are certain things that a cooperative is really the best solution, or other sorts of things. And I think the one problem there, one reason why you probably need a network, a framework of some kind. You have 30% of your cases so far are in the other category. That's a little under theorized kind of situation. You've got a third of the thing is just sort of in the, I can't deal with that yet. And so, have you thought about coming up with some sort of a inventory or classification of the types of institutions, the type of initiatives that are going, they're not based on what they're doing, but sort of what's the governance structure within them? And do you see this project moving in the way where you could get to a point where you could, if a group came to you saying, here is our problem, well, you might try this organization and you might connect to this group over here, 300 miles away that did something very similar that you otherwise wouldn't have any direct connection to. Can you see yourself in that position decades
Yeah,
down?
well, first, thank you for all the comments. That's a really nice interpretation. And we're just scratching the surface of this database. So what you see as others there was indeed a way of, okay, we know very clearly the productive activities, market activities, territorial governance activities. And then this all other variations that are there is sometimes with very specific purpose. Like a women's group who's, maybe touching on all of those, but they have other purpose as well, or a youth group and so forth. So I guess maybe Christer can help me respond here. I think that's the idea that we have now. We only took one paper out of this database, and we did so in a more deductive than inductive way, right? So we had this categories and end up classifying, and those that didn't, fit, we're still on the ground. We're now in the process of getting from a more inductive way. So from that material, how do we kind of reinterpret ways of categorizing types of organization, different kinds of activities that are not as visible here, so incomplete answer, but that's what we hope to actually take advantage of the database.
Great. Excellent. Christer, please.
All right.
A major part of this project, so great that you're here.
Great job, Edu. Always a pleasure listening to you. So just as a quick follow-up to Mike's excellent question, perhaps one thing that could be emphasized in our results about the external partnerships is that what we found in our quantitative analysis of this database was that it's not the number of partners or the number of partnerships that matter, it's the diversity of those partnerships. So links the different types of actors, which I think is quite consistent with the idea of more flexible polycentric systems rather than just uniform blueprint top-down kind of things. Anyway, so that might be something we emphasize even more in the paper, that it's really about the diversity, not just the number of connectors with a particular perhaps government type agencies and stuff like that. And then I have a question more about terminology for you, Eduardo. The word transformation, I think, was very well used throughout your presentation, especially when we're looking at like these broad patterns, both temporal and spatial patterns that are large in nature. Like you can really see the transformation when you look at, the last century of data on landscape changes and so forth. So my question is really, when you're in the middle of it and visiting an initiative and you're talking about changes that are occurring, to what point, when will those changes be appropriate to be called transformations as opposed to just like small incremental changes? Because that's something I'm struggling with. Like whenever people use the word transformation, and it's being thrown a lot in our circles these days, and natural resource, climate change, and et cetera. So I just perceive some tension there that perhaps it's getting a bit inflated. So that's my own interpretation, that we throw it around a lot, but perhaps shouldn't be. So I just want your take on how we should use transformation more appropriately, perhaps.
Well, that's a $1 billion question for this community, as you know. I use it very carefully here and try not to use in a way that would represent a specific concept, because I think we lack a theory of what we mean by transformation. And so I don't want to venture there. I use it as a sequence to the program. But I'll give a couple of examples, I think, that to me represented transformation as seeing it on the ground, even though I don't think we have a framework, to really capture that. For instance, two examples, I think, talking and discussing the history of a women's association in the region of Belterra. And their discussion of their association, how it came about and where they are today, was, just a very concrete history of transformation, because there you're talking about changing the position of people in the systems in where they live in a way that is substantive, like from a very oppressive situation, literally, physically, emotionally, to taking leadership, form associations, bring projects, and sort of become leaders of communities because of they reposition themselves in the social context in which they have. And that's, to me, a very clear example of transformation, because they are different actors at that point, right? And they have a whole different level of agency at that point. I've seen that where I worked for 35 years, where when I started there, most of the people were sharecroppers, completely subjected to their landowners, right? And over time, not an immediate saying, but over time, when you see a different position that their kids have now, in terms of, being independent actors, being sort of out of the system in which they grew up, that would define everything from where they lived, to what they would do in life, and sort of breaking apart from that system over a long period of time in this case. But that to me is transformation. I mean, we have a significant change in, the agency of people. But that's, I think we have a lot to do there. But those interested, we had a special issue on transformation. I co-author a chapter that does a quick review of the literature on transformation. It is a very inconclusive literature, it's just a literature with many fronts, but very sort of, converging, as I said, we lack a good talk about it.
I feel like we're just getting started, but unfortunately, we're also having to wrap up. But Gustavo, I think you had a quick one.
Yes, so couple of comments. Of course, I super enjoy this. It's like my mind is blowing in several directions. But a couple of comments with the local thing. I think it's important to remind ourselves that the double edged source of local things. So I'm sure that ranchers, farmers, they want to clean up until the last acre and put soybean and cattle. They're also part of the local environment. So essentially, it can go one direction or the other. And then the second comment, which is, I think, related to the local thing versus the global things, like, I think the Amazon is two things at the same time. It's a marginalized area, and then they are the local thing. I see a lot the connection, but then there is all the ecological feature, and that part is by nature global, because it's like the key point there is that essentially we are all benefiting from ecological services from the Amazon, and we're not paying for those things. And then, in some sense, that problem is not local, almost by definition, no. So again, the marginalized area, I think you can find a lot of connections with pretty much any marginalized areas. Logistical problems, pretty much every marginalized area face logistical problems. So essentially, I see there the connection with the local thing. Okay. But for the global perspective, the locals pretty much, I would say, it works in the wrong direction. No, it's because you are not internalizing the global benefit that everybody else is enjoying. You want to overuse this resource in the long run. So essentially, those are the key trade-off. No, that's
no, very nice. Oh, I wish we had more time to discuss. Yeah, I agree. It's a double-edged sword because the local rangers, those groups promoting fire, they are also place-based initiatives, right? Just pursuing what they're pursuing. So the question is, what extent you have those pursuing questions that are more in line with the ecology of the region and the social problems of the region will be able to, overcome those who pushing and who have a lot more partnerships and funding, right, to promote what they want. I think on the local global connection, yeah, I think that's what Amazon today is clear at the center of that debate, right? Not only because of global climate change, the whole continental weather pattern, depends on the region, and it's changing equally very, very fast. Now, the part of the point that we're trying to make here, and that I didn't talk about, but we're doing similar work at a global level, comparing particular indigenous groups at a global level. And part of the message that we try to do and show empirically is that those contributions and their role in the global environmental change is not local. It has regional implication and global implications. And that's the connection that we're trying to make. This very localized initiative, they have emergent properties that have global implications. And when you look globally, well, when you look in the Amazon, for one thing, you take indigenous areas, you take traditional population areas, you take sustainable use reserves, you're talking about more than half of the region in which they are managing. So their management has an implication that has global consequence. Globally, when you look at indigenous people only, not looking at rural communities, it's a quarter of the terrestrial surface being managed by indigenous groups at the local level. Some of the most important global watersheds in huge metropolitan areas are managed by indigenous people. So, I summarized that in a recent review paper that I published about the topic. This is called Locally Based, Regional Manifested, Globally Relevant. And that's the connection that we're trying to show, that these actions are relevant at all levels for what they represent. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Wish we had more time. Well, we do have food, so please stick around, continue the conversation. Do we have food? I think yes. And there's a Beyond the Web at 2:00 today that Angie and Doc are hosting, and the research series on Wednesday. Be there at B Square for Shannon. You do like a biodiversity or something. There's so much.